It's a great pleasure to be here again. I was here 10 years ago. Seems like just a flash, but time does fly. And so probably doesn't, it's a whole different topic, so that's good. I've moved on a little bit. We'll start with a quote from the patron saint of my field of personality psychology, Gordon Allport, who basically is saying here that the experience of situations is important. So there's the world out there of some sort, and you can divide it up into episodes, or you can divide it up in different ways, or you can divide it up into situations that we experience. And the way you experience them is important because we don't all experience them the same way, which is Allport's point here. It also is reminiscent of another ancestor, founding figure of our field, Kurt Lewin, who said that behavior is a function of the person in the situation, and apparently he gets misinterpreted a lot, but I'll just go ahead and misinterpret him in the classic way and say that behavior is a function of the person in the situation. I think that makes perfect sense, that you can't have one without the other. You have no behavior if you don't have both. But if you actually do take that equation a little bit seriously for a second as an equation, then you can derive two other things. It says that the person is a function of behavior in the situation. In other words, you could say that a person is the sum total of everything you do in all the situations of your life, which is not a terrible definition, actually, if such things go. Or situations are a function of what everybody in those situations does in it. So you can rotate those terms around, and that actually leads to a bunch of interesting analytic possibilities, most of which will go untapped today, but I like to think about things that way. The way person and situation, in this case, are linked to behavior is via what is sometimes called construal. In fact, I use that term a lot, but also you can just think of it as experience. And so construal and experience are more or less synonymous. Construal sort of denotes or connotes the idea that different people may experience the same situation differently, but in the end, experience is experience. You're experiencing what you're experiencing, and that's obviously critical. Whoops. So this is something I call the situational construal model, and again, this is just to show you that it exists. And the key thing is that the way you experience a situation is a joint function of what's really there and what you bring to it. And then what you do is going to be a function of that. So if you want to play with a framework like that, and I do, it implies you need to measure all three elements of it in terms that you can associate them with each other. So there's lots of ways to assess the person. Many personality inventories. 16,587 trait words in the unabridged English dictionary, according to Allport and Odbert. Or there's just the big five, if that's too many for you. Or there's the CAQ, which I think is just right, because that's 100 attributes of personality that you can use to describe people with. Behavior, there's actually fewer measures of behavior. Psychology is supposedly the science of behavior. I don't know if you missed it, but if you slept through the years 2000 to 2010, that was officially the decade of behavior. I don't know how that went exactly, but it's over now. I'm not sure what decade this is. But but one of the interesting things about behavior in psychology is we don't really measure behavior very often. Or if we do, the typical psychological study has one DV, which is your behavior, which might be a reaction time or how fast you walk or something like that, how many showers you take. But behavior comprehensively isn't assessed very often. The Riverside Behavioral Q-Sort is an attempt to do that. So it actually has 68 items, and it's meant to describe sort of everything you're doing at a given moment. So not just a single DV, but 68 things. And we'll see some of those items in just a little bit because I'm going to use them. What about situations? There's even less for that. Nisbet and Ross wrote a book about 25 years ago now that's very, very famous called The Person and the Situation. And the whole point was it's the situation that really matters. But there's not a word said anywhere in that book about how to measure situations. The reason we know situations are so important from that classic analysis is that personality traits don't always correlate very highly with behavioral outcomes. So the rest of it obviously is the situation. So what we've done is, of course, we've said that we're going to measure one thing and not measure another and say the thing we're not measuring is more important than the thing we are measuring. And there's something ironic about that. So we're trying to do something about that. There are some people who've tried to classify situations, Joe Fergus and Gus Van Heck and various other people, a lot of Harry Reese and Hal Kelly's people have done a lot of stuff on that. But to my way of thinking, some of this prior work on situational assessment, I won't say barked up the wrong tree, but barked up the wrong tree a little bit. Because what they did was, there's nothing wrong with the idea. Their goal of their research was to come up with what the essential dimensions of situations were. I want to say there are 6, and here they are. And so there's a whole bunch of people who have their different schemes. No two are even particularly similar to each other. And more critically, from my point of view, is none of them yielded an assessment tool. And I think saying, my own view is that situational assessment is kind of where personality psychology was in about 1935, when Gordon Allport started to say, you know what, there's these things called traits. We might want to figure out some ways to measure them. He was a long ways from the Big Five in 1935. And if he had tried to jump to the Big Five then, it would have been very premature. I think we're kind of that way with situations as well. So I want to just start measuring them. I'm impatient. Like Marty, I'm easily bored. So I don't want to just sit around and worry about classification. I want to just start measuring stuff. So that's where this Riverside Situational Q sort came from, the RSQ. It has 89 items. And they're meant to describe a situation or your experience of it. You can think of it as objectively or subjectively, but it's a description of a situation. And they're intended to be visible and easily rated by any socially competent observer. So it's things like, well, you'll see the items in a moment. You don't need special training to rate things on the RSQ. It's something that socially competent people can do. It could be the person themselves describing their own experience of the situation. You could have a peer observe it. You could have RAs watch videotapes of a situation and do it. You can aggregate them across people in this situation. You can aggregate them across people in a culture, which we will be doing before we're done here. And they're meant to be at sort of a middle level of analysis. So if you were going to describe this situation, here's a situation for you. And the reason I like that is that's the situation room. So that if that's not a situation, I don't know what is. And what's going on there? Well, they're in a conference. The walls are white. Did you notice the walls are white? There's 12 chairs in the room. Now, somehow, one of those seems a little too high level. Some of those others seem a little too low level to really capture the gist of what's going on. What if you used items like the situation is potentially emotionally arousing, which I think, can I just say, I think you see that there. Success requires cooperation. A decision needs to be made. Yeah. These, of course, are 3 of the items of the RSQ. There are 86 more, but those are 3 of them. So they're based on the CAQ. I won't go into that today. So like all Q sorts, the word Q sort sometimes freaks people out a little bit. You guys are doing very well today. Because sometimes I say Q sort and people kind of go, I think the letter Q is kind of scary. People should. I once asked one of the old Q sort guys, how come it's called a Q sort? And he said the letter R was taken. So nobody knows why it's Q. But really, there's nothing mysterious about a Q sort. It's really just a rank ordering with ties allowed. So you rank all the items from the highest to lowest. If you had 89, you could rank them from highest to lowest, except you don't really have to rank them from highest to lowest. You get to put 3 in the highest category. And you can put 6, I think, in the next highest, and so forth. And it's meant to be a normal-ish distribution like that, because I'm already starting out thinking most of the items are really neither particularly characteristic nor uncharacteristic. Or maybe they don't make any sense in this context, or they're just weird, or you don't understand them. That's fine. Just throw them in the middle. It's fine. But when the items make it out here, you're making a very strong statement. When they make it over there, you're making a very strong statement about that items, because these items are competing with each other. Who gets to be in this category? Who gets to be in that category? So for example, one of the items is members of the opposite sex are present. Well, in many situations in life, maybe nearly all members of the opposite sex are present. But you have to decide, is that one of the 3 items that most characterizes this situation? So it's not just, is it true or not, but how salient is it, how important is it as a descriptor of this situation relative to the other 88 items I could also use to describe this situation. So that's how you sort them. And one of the nice properties, there's a lot of nice properties, but one of them is that you can do holistic comparisons. So there is a lot of work that does all sorts of comparison in our field, compares single dimensions. But if we want to say, your situation you experienced at 8 o'clock this morning and the one you're going to experience this evening at 6 p.m., how similar are they to each other? We actually don't have a way to answer that. And are those 2 situations more similar to each other than they are to the situation you're in right now? So now of those three situations, which two are the most similar? We don't actually have a method for doing that. Actually, yes, we do. We have the RSQ. Because what you can do is you can have an RSQ of each of those three situations, and you can simply compare them holistically with each other just by taking the 8 and 9 items and just correlating them with each other. So you can also correlate situations with theoretical templates. So if you have an idea of what a certain kind of situation is like, you can have a theoretical template of it, and you can measure that situation in terms of that theoretical template simply by correlating it. And that comes from old-fashioned work with the personality Q sort, where you could do that with personality types, or even psychological diagnoses was the original use, one of the original uses of it. In this case, we're simply saying, here's a hypothetical situation that matches this theoretical template. Here's how closely this particular situation matches it. And we'll see this used in just a minute. One of the other nice properties of the Q sort is it does some good things about response sets. It doesn't quite wipe them out, but it wipes out a couple of them. Gets rid of acquiescence response set, which you don't hear a lot about anymore, but old-time personality assessment people used to worry about that a lot, the idea that some people answer yes to almost everything, some people answer no to almost everything. That's actually a particular concern in cross-cultural work, actually. Less so within a culture. But you can't do that with the Q sort because it's a forced choice. The other one is extremity. Some people like to use the extreme. Some people like to hug the middle. It won't let you do that. You have to spread out your ratings. It lessens social desirability. It doesn't wipe it out. But if you want to say either a self-description or you want to describe a situation in some idealized way, you're going to discover you can't because there's only room for 3 items in category 9. You're going to have to put some of them in category 8. So if you're describing yourself, you can't put all the good items there. You can't put all the bad items in item 1. If you're trying to describe something about a situation in a desirable way, you can't. I mean, you can, but you're going to still have to spread out the desirable items because they won't all fit in category 1 or in category 9. Same thing applies to halo effect and the reference group effect as well. You can't just hear it probably lessens the reference group effect because you're not comparing items on an absolute scale against some hypothetical population. You're comparing the items with each other as to which of them is more salient within that context. We'll get back to that. Which means it might be particularly useful for cross-cultural research. So that'll be the third thing we talk about today. I just want to talk about our initials. This isn't even officially part of the talk, but I just wanted to introduce the data set that I'll be using in a minute. This was done at UCR over a period of a couple of years. Had 202 undergraduates, exactly balanced for gender. They came to the lab 5 times over a period of an academic quarter. The first session they simply did usual demographics and personality stuff. And sessions 2 to 5 were more interesting. We had them report on what they were doing at a time in the previous 24 hours. We actually had several different times, and we had Latin square design and stuff that my grad students understand a lot better than I do. But it was just, the important thing was it was less than 24 hours ago. So presumably you haven't forgotten. The first thing you do is you write down what you were doing. We actually initially tried saying, what situation were you in? We discovered that to normal humans that means nothing. They have no idea what you're talking about. So now we just say, what are you doing? What were you doing? And they'll say, I was at the grocery store shopping with my mom. I was making dinner. I was taking a nap. I was studying for my midterm. Just typical, undergraduate stuff. And we had them write it down on a 3x5 card. We used a 3x5 card so they wouldn't go on and on. We didn't want to give them a length, but we just gave them a little tangible symbol that there's really not a lot of room in this card. So, and then they did an RSQ on a computer screen. They did a description of that situation using the RSQ. And then they actually, after that, they described their behavior in that situation using the RBQ, which also uses a forced distribution of that sort and was also done on a computer screen. This was all done in our lab on our own computers. So what did we find? Well, this was a study of behavioral consistency. And what we found, does this have a pointer in it? Yeah, good. Is that people's situations over time tend to be more similar to each other than they are to situations experienced by other people. So in other words, Susan's situation 1 will be more similar to her 2, to her 3, to 4 than this is to this, or this is to this, or this is to this, this is to this. In fact, within people, the average cross-situational correlation of similarity correlation is 0.33. Within any 2 people at random, it's 0.20. So there is kind of a typical situation, but they're more typical for a given person than for not. And by the way, I don't know if this is stunning, but let me tell you, this is a brand new finding. Right? We've never shown that people experience similar situations to them that over time, more similar than situations other people experience, because there was literally no method to do it with. How would you do it? You need something to assess it with. Now we've got a method. So I don't think it's the most profound finding anybody ever found, but I will say it's the first time it's been shown because you didn't have a method for it. And of course, it's intuitively clear, so it's probably even replicate. Okay. And this 0.20, by the way, is a number we will see again. So hey, remember that. So we also find, again, something that isn't surprising, but something you need this method to show, that people will behave more consistently across situations that they see as being more similar. That's not surprising, right? If two situations are more similar, you're more likely to act the same way in both of them. In fact, the correlation between how similarly people see the situation and how similarly they behave in them is 0.66. So that's pretty clear. And people tend to experience similar situations. Aha, is this why behavior is consistent? Because people experience similar situations. Is that the only reason behavior is consistent? Well, I went to grad school, and Walter Mischel was one of my professors, actually. So yes, no. Actually, no, it's not true, because you can actually statistically control, statistically adjust for the tendency of people to experience similar situations and see if their behavior is consistent over and above what you would predict by that, and the answer is they are. So again, I don't think that's a surprising finding, but it's a new finding, and again, you couldn't have shown it without a method to assess situations. Now let's get to the real stuff, because this is the UCLA special talk today. A little bit trepidatious, as I was telling Clark and Marty before we started. I'm now going to areas where people in this room know a lot more about it than I do. One of them is evolutionary psychology, and the other is cultural anthropology. And I know very little about both, as will become very clear very soon. So let's see how we do this. My foray into evolutionary psychology was accidental. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, really. I find it very interesting, but it's not really my thing on a daily basis. But I was trying to come up with a basis to have typologies of situations. Because 89 items, granted, is kind of cumbersome. And they were meant to be sort of atheoretical. I think that's a strength, actually, of the device, is it's not committed to any particular theory in advance. But once you've got that, there's a desire to simplify life or to make things more coherent by having a basis to classify situations together. And as far as I know, there's only two ways to do that. One is brute force. One is just to dump all your data into a great big computer program and let the computer spit back to you what the types are. I don't know what your experience is with that. My experiences usually are traumatic because it spits back a bunch of stuff that almost kind of sort of makes sense and then doesn't necessarily show up in the next sample I look at. And I wish I had an N of 50,000 instead of my puny 2,000. It's just like, maybe there's a way to do it. But or theory. So I actually spent about 6 months of my life going around asking people, have you ever heard that anybody have a theory of situational types? Like, no, nobody's ever theorized about it. Gus Van Heck has this. No, that's not a real theory. Does anybody have like a real theory that generates situational types? And I got just as a sort of a friendly gesture, a copy of Doug Kenrick's, the Kenrick Cialdini Newberg social psychology book, undergraduate text. Very good. The one, if you teach social psych, you should definitely use that book. And I'm just leafing through it because Doug in particular is a really good writer, so it was just kind of fun to poke around. And I came across and said, yeah, according to evolutionary theory, there's 7 basic types of situations. What? Wait, what? Evolutionary theory is it types of situations? Really? So I went to Doug and I said, Doug, is this true? And yes, it's these. Okay. And then Kenrick, Newberg, and Schaller say that there are 7 basic kinds of situations based on their evolutionary theorizing. And I realized, you know what? I've got data, the data you just saw, the 202 UC Riverside undergraduates. I already have their situations they were in, and I already have what they did in them. Would we like to know, and I actually asked this to Doug, would you be curious to know how frequently people experience these different kinds of situations? Would that be of interest to your community? And would you like to know what people do in them? Because I got the data. So let's see. So that's exactly what we did. So And it's actually even in press right now. So here's what we did. We actually had to try to get Doug to do it, and he was a terrible rater. We fired Kenrick as a rater. And instead, we started working with, I guess she was a student of Steve Newberg at the time, named Becca Neal. Do you know her at all? She's really good. She was actually a grad student at ASU at the time. She is now an assistant professor at University of Iowa. But she organized a group of real experts, more than what we had in Riverside, in evolutionary psychology. And she took the RSQ deck that we always used, and she had the experts, which was basically her and several other people in the ASU Evolutionary Psych Lab, provide us idealized templates of the perfect examples of each of those types in terms of RSQ templates. So we're now in a position to take each and every one of the just over 1,000 situational descriptions, well, let me think, 808 situational descriptions, because there's 202 people, 4 situations each. So we have 808 situational descriptions in our data set. And we can calculate a similarity score between each and every one of those situations and each of those templates. So what do you get? This is how you do it. It's pretty straightforward, right? You've got the theoretical template, you have each, and you have 808 of those. And of course you have one of these, but you have 808 of those scores now. Is that clear, I hope? It's just a similarity score.
So you're treating this as an ordinal number, which template it is?
This theoretical template is the aggregate of the 4 experts at ASU who described what, for example, the mate retention situation looks like.
What does the magnitude of the number mean?
The magnitude means that this situation matches that template. So it's a mate retention situation.
So the ones that are more evolutionarily similar are close, have numbers that are close to each other? Is that the...
No, the idea is that a situation that falls into that category will have a higher kin care score. Okay. So how frequent a high-end score? Probably my wording of that is probably throwing you off, because I actually wrote it more correctly the second time. What is the distribution of similarity scores for each type? That's really what we're getting at. So there they are. You can see this is affiliation. These are the scores. This is a correlation of about 0.3, which is actually pretty high if you remember in terms of this. Anything above 0.2 is above baseline, really. So affiliation is pretty common. Mate seeking is pretty common. Status, disease avoidance is less common. Kin care, self-protection, mate retention, or if you just want to summarize.
Riverside undergraduate data.
Yeah. Yeah. So in them, I know. Again, not surprising. These were the most common situations. These were the least common situations. And I don't think that's surprising, but it's just kind of a demonstration of how it works, really. I know, especially in my field of originally I was trained in social psychology. I was trained to value counterintuitive findings, but I kind of like intuitive findings because they have a way of being real. So I actually kind of like it. At least it reassures me there's nothing strange going on in the data, because this is kind of what you would expect, right? So that makes me happy, actually. Now, what do people do in these situations? Again, you're not going to be shocked. Self-protection. Remember the 3x5 cards? These are just examples of a couple situations that got high scores on self-protection. So somebody had broken into somebody's house, and this one's got a high self-protection score. So I don't know what's going on. That family dynamics might be problematical. But this is what people do in situations that are high in self-protection, or they're self-protection type situations. They're tense, they're irritated, they're not laughing. Those are negative correlations. They're not having fun. For a man, it's just pretty much the same thing.
David, I'm confused. So my folk theory of self-protection is there's an imminent threat, and the individual is taking steps to address that imminent threat, typically of physical harm. I mean, does eating lunch count as self-protection in this criteria?
Only if it matches the template. Probably not. May not be clear. I may not be being clear about where these scores are coming from.
I understand that you outsourced it to
Right.
Doug and Steve, and apparently no one ever eats in Arizona because there's nothing about consuming food or water.
These are correlations. These are variants, right? So if everybody's eating lunch, that won't show up in a correlation, right? It's just that in situations that are higher in self-protection, people are more likely to be tense. That's all. People that are lower, to the degree they're lower in self-protection, they're not having fun. So these are pretty obvious findings. Affiliation, these are ones that are high in affiliation. What I like about this is it brings to life what those abstract situational category labels mean. These are the real ones that actually match it. And this is what people do in affiliation situations. Again, nothing surprising here. I'm putting up males and females just because I have the data, but you're not really seeing big sex differences here at all. Mate seeking. These were the items that got high scores on mate seeking. This is what they wrote on their card anyway. So I guess something else was, there's a subtext here probably. And something else was going on there too. But this is what women do in situations that get high scores on mate seeking. So they're having fun and smiling, they're not irritated, they're not anxious. Men are initiating humor, laugh, and frequency. This actually shows the classic mate-seeking thing, which is men make jokes and women pretend to find them funny. So the RSQ can also assess, you can do a lot more than this than I did. You could look at the overlap and distinctiveness of these types, and we did find out that at least a couple of these types, like the affiliation and the, I'll look at these in a while, but the affiliation and one of the other ones, templates are really highly correlated with each other. So there's probably fewer than really 7 distinct types, at least in terms of the RSQ, even though the theory said there were 7. So it can start helping you explore that. We can also, we haven't done these analyses yet, although we could, is to look and see what kinds of people find themselves in these kinds of situations. So what kinds of people are more likely to find themselves in a threat situation or a mate-seeking situation or an affiliation situation. And I'd like to do this too. If anybody else has other theoretical perspectives that provide situational typologies, I'd love to use those as well. I'm not particularly wedded to the evolutionary one, but it was the only game in town, and so far the only one I found. You could also compare them with empirically derived typologies. So if you had empirically derived factors or types of situations, you could also explore their implications using this method to see what people do in them. And maybe you could do comparisons across cultures. So that's our next thing. And this is the official title of today. So this is a term I've recently just kind of been playing around with. The proposal, and this is where I feel on thin ice around real anthropologists, but I think you could make a case that situational experience is the active ingredient of culture, or at least it's an active ingredient of culture. The way culture communicates itself to you or influences you every day is through the situations that you experience in that culture and how you experience them. At the same time, of course, you're affecting the situations that are part of your culture, so it works both directions. But I think sort of where the rubber meets the road between a person and the culture they inhabit is in their experience of the situations that occur in that culture on a daily basis. So a first question is, how is situational experience similar and different around the world? Well, there's traditional anthropological field work. And don't get me wrong, I love this stuff. I used to take courses in it back when I was in grad school. I learned a lot about betel nut chewing in the Philippines, for example, at one point. But typically, the typical work in that is often qualitative, and some of it almost on principled grounds tries to avoid classification or comparison. Like each culture needs to be understood in its own right, and I understand that and appreciate that. But I'm a psychologist. I'm not afraid to compare cultures. I mean, I know it's wrong, but I do it. And so cross-cultural psychologists are more likely to be willing to compare one culture to another in common terms. And there actually is a pretty large literature in cross-cultural psychology that looks at person-level variables. Either personality itself, like there's an awful lot of studies about the big five and whether they can be found in one culture or another. There's also a lot of studies on things like self-esteem around the world and the circumstances that affect self-esteem around the world, and how people can construe things broadly or narrowly and so forth. But these are all person attributes. There's much less comparison of situational variables. There actually is a little bit. Shinuba Katayama has done a little bit. Gelman's done a little bit of this, but they're almost always hypothetical situations, and the typical study has 2 countries in it. Usually the US and Japan, for some reason, although occasionally you see other pairs of countries. And never has anybody ever compared holistically, is the experience of situations in this culture similar or different than it is in this other culture? Or of these 3 cultures, which 2 have the most similar situational experience? Why? Because there hasn't been a tool available until now to describe situational experience comprehensively to allow that kind of a holistic question to be asked and at least tentatively answered. The situational variables that have been studied by Kitayama, for example, are elements of situations that affect your self-esteem, which is an interesting thing to study, but it doesn't get at the question of, well, yeah, but are situations more similar in the US and Korea than they are to Japan, for example? So we're going to do that. So we did a study. It took us 4 years of data gathering by the time we recruited people and got people to do this. Our current N, it's always changing actually, but it's 5,447 in 20 countries. People go to our website, which is right there, and the website walks them through. I should mention one other thing. These subjects, this is not an Amazon Turk study. This is not we threw something up on the internet. We have collaborators in each of these 20 countries. They're all psychologists, they're all university-based. They all recruited our participants for us, gave them the study ID and the login information. So we sort of know who these people are. These aren't just random Amazon Turkers who have 11 windows open at the same time. These are more subject pool type people. Yeah. In this study, they're mostly university students or affiliates, mostly students, yeah. Which is good and bad, right? It's bad because university students are different from everybody else. That's true in this country as well as other countries. And that they may underestimate cultural differences because there is an international sort of university culture. On the other hand, we're not comparing people with grossly different educational levels, ages, economic statuses either. So it kind of cuts both ways. Ultimately, in fact, I have a grant proposal in right now to redo this study with much more representative samples, which I'd really like to do. But right now, they're all university samples, yes. And they're all recruited by our RAs, or not our RAs, our collaborators. Our collaborators also did the translations, and we did back translations with them. So we actually have, I think, pretty good quality sites, data site. This, if you go to internationalsituationsproject.com, that's the first thing you'll see. So I think it's 15 different languages that the site operates in. And then once you've done that, you are asked to put in your study ID and your participant number. And then here's an example of a screenshot from the Japanese site. So I just wrote eating sushi up there, but what they actually do is the first screen, it's sort of like the analogous to that 3x5 card I told you about in our on-site study. They get a blank screen, purposely made kind of small, and they're asked, what were you doing yesterday at 7 p.m.? And by the way, we picked 7 p.m. because we didn't want to have everybody at work or in school. We didn't want everybody asleep. We just tried to pick a time of day where seemed like a lot of that was free to vary. A lot of people are having dinner, but not everybody. So at least there is some variance of what people are doing. They write in their own language what they were doing, and then that takes them to the next screen where what they just wrote is displayed for them. So this reminds them of the situation that they're describing in their own words. So if this was a real Japanese person doing it, this would be in Japanese up here. And then what they do is the first stage actually, which this screenshot skips, is first they get each of the cards one at a time, each of the 89, and they're told to put them into 3 categories: uncharacteristic, characteristic, and just kind of in between. And they're not constrained as to how many they can put into those 3 categories. That's just to make the sorting task a little easier, because after they've done that, the next screen requires them to sort them into the actual force distribution. And they can't get it wrong because the computer won't let them get it wrong, which is actually, with the old days, I go back to paper cards. People got it wrong a lot, but on the computer they can't. So once they've done that, here's some of the situations people actually wrote. These are real, translated, of course, in some cases. And we did kind of go out of our way to find culture-specific ones. I mean, they really were doing karaoke in Japan. And the people in Italy really did eat a lot of pizza, turns out. That's not just a stereotype, they really do. I like the Estonian one. They were in the sauna at 7 p.m. the previous day with grandma. So here's some initial descriptive questions we can ask. You can do theoretical stuff too, but I got really excited when we gathered these data because nobody's ever done this before. That's always fun. So what is the typical situational experience around the world at 7 p.m.? What does it look like? I have no idea, right? What data would you use to answer a question like that? To what degree is situational experience similar and different across cultures? In particular, which ones are the most similar, which ones are the most different? Is there cultures that are more similar to others? I just said that. And how does the similarity of situational experience within cultures compare to its similarity across cultures? In other words, we can correlate the RSQs of each person in each country with each other, and then we can also do it across cultures. So that's a massive number of correlations, of course, but the good old computer can crank them out in no time. So we can actually see, is situational experience more homogeneous within a culture than across a culture? It ought to be, right? You would think. But we don't know. I've never seen any data like that before. So we're going to be able to do that. So we can do that from these data. And then how do the specific elements of situational experience, which is what I'm presumptively calling the 89 items of the RSQ, how do they vary across culture? And which ones vary the most, which ones vary the least? So we can answer all of those. So let's do that. First of all, here's the items that were rated highest on average around the world in 20 countries. It's 7 p.m. So there's 7 p.m. around the world, people. College people around the world at 7 p.m. My colleague Dan Ozer, has a way of every once in a while saying things that turn out to be, yes? Yeah.
I'm trying to map these onto the Evolutionary Psychology 7 types, and it's very hard for me to look at something like situation is basically simple and clear cut and know which one they're lumping that
I have no idea
into,
either.
or situation is potentially enjoyable.
I have no idea.
Okay.
No. We've moved on beyond evolutionary now.
So those 7 types are not relevant to the problem.
No. Well, they could be. I actually haven't gone back and looked. That's something, very good. We could actually see whether there's a different distribution of those 7 types in the different countries.
These are the same RSQ items that were used in the other.
Well, they are, although it's a completely different data set. Those were UCR undergraduates.
Right, but I mean,
They are the same items.
these are the items that were being rated as being part of this.
So we could actually see whether self-protection situations are more common in some cultures than others. That's a very good idea. We have not done that.
So, but for those situations, so like social interaction is possible. That can be there's more than one of those 7 types that item could be highly characteristic of.
That's right.
Yeah. So there's not a one-to-one mapping.
Yeah,
between
no,
the
I know.
item
I'm
and
just
the
having a
situation.
0 of 7 mapping of some of these is more of a.
Well, that's what that's what category 5 is for, right? You just throw, when they're not relevant, you throw them in category 5. But affiliation, I would be surprised if item 56 isn't highly rated in the affiliation one. So some of them I don't know either. So what you're seeing is so I was going to quote Dan Ozer as saying that he thought the typical situation around the world for all people, if you could somehow average them all together, that it was mildly pleasant. And I think he's about right. That sounds mildly pleasant to me. And then here's the least, these are the ones that on average got the lowest ratings. These are the items that got the lowest ratings. So being abused and victimized, fortunately, is the very lowest. And so these are all nasty items, but these are the ones that got rated at the bottom of the distribution when you average just across everybody. Although, I don't know what's going on here. Maybe 7 p.m. just isn't a good time. I don't know. But that's not very salient on average. Sorry, people. Heartbreaking, actually. Okay. So we'll come back to some of those too. But let's look at the 20 countries then that we have, and let's just see. Yes.
In the countries, this is like modern measurements and modern.
Yeah, you'll see the list of the countries in the very next slide.
We're not looking at any
No, no, no. We couldn't find any hunter-gatherer tribes with internet access that wasn't unreliable. So, yeah, no, although, you know, that's changing so fast that suddenly internet access is a routine thing around the world to a much greater degree than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. So this study is rapidly becoming easier and easier to do. If we could find local collaborators to do that. I really like working through local collaborators. I sort of don't like the, you know, the phrase research by 747, you know, where you zoom into a country and zoom out. I really like having the fact that the co-author of the paper that reports this, for example, has 32 authors, because we're all participants in it. We all work together on this. Anyway, so here's our, so what you can do here is just, again, very simple, good old R, my favorite number in all statistics. You just take one country and another country, and you take everybody in country one, and you just average all their RSQs together. And that's the average description of 7 p.m. in that country, across, in some cases, several hundred people. We actually did it separately by gender and then combined, because so that males and females will contribute equally to that mean. And then in another country, do the same thing. You average across everybody in that country, and you get an average 7 p.m. And then your R tells you how similar the average situational experience in this country is to that one. And here's the numbers. So let's go through each of these. No, not really, but you see they're all in general pretty high, higher than I would have guessed. But on the other hand, we're correlating averages with averages. We're using Q-sort data. When you correlate averages with averages, you tend to get high correlations. There is a strong template of the average situation. Another way of saying is that most situations around the world look kind of like that. That's sort of what this tells you. The most similar two countries, the US and Canada. Again, that makes me happy, because, you know, you've got all these data pouring into your computer and you start to do it and you go, I want to see some obvious things before I believe the rest of it. And I was happy when US and Canada came out the most similar. The most different are Korea, or least similar, I should say, are South Korea and Denmark. So I don't know if that's what you would have predicted, but it's not terribly surprising. The country that's most similar to all of the others on average, so maybe the most typical country in some ways, is Canada. There we go. And the two most distinctive, the ones with that are least similar, although still pretty similar on average, are Japan and South Korea, although they're not, where's that correlation? They're not terribly similar to each other. So they're distinctive in different ways on this scale. So that's just a little, I don't know what to make of that, but there you go. There's something else you can do, and I just mentioned that a minute ago. You can also do this at the individual level. So that was at the cultural level. Those were at the country level. We're comparing national averages to each other. We can also take each individual in each country and correlate that person with each other individual in that same country. So if, let's say our N is 100, we can calculate 99 correlations for subject 1. And then 99 for subject, well, actually, you lose one each time, but you end up correlating everybody with everybody else within that culture. That's a whole bunch of correlations, and you just take that average. And that's the average similarity of each individual to each other individual's experience in that culture. Is that clear? Alternatively, person 1 and person 2 might be in two different countries. So you can take each individual and correlate them with each individual's RSQ in each of the other countries. Thousands and thousands of correlations, actually, on the order of 25,000 correlations, something like that. But good old computers can do all that. And then you just average those together. So you can start getting a little measure of within and across cultural homogeneity of cultural experience. So here's what you get. First of all, the first thing you'll notice is these numbers are a lot smaller, because we're no longer correlating countries with countries. We're correlating individuals with individuals. And the average across everything, this diagonal, is the within country similarity of people, how similar their situational experience is to each other. Okay? That's the bold-faced diagonals. That averages out to 0.20. Remember I told you you'd see 0.20 again? 0.20 was the average relationship between people who had different people's situations in the Riverside data. So it's exactly the same number here. So within cultural homogeneity is about 0.20. Across cultural homogeneity averages out to 1.8, which isn't all that much lower. I mean, it's in the right direction. It's significant if you're into that. Barely, I guess, or barely not if you're into that. But, you know, it's not dramatically different. So that may be because they're all college people. I don't know. We need better or wider data to really find out what's going on. The most internally homogeneous culture in terms of situational experience was Japan. So the situations were more similar to each other within Japan. The least homogeneous was South Korea, and the others were, and just barely, the Korean data is a little funky, but just above that, the US, and that's ZA is South Africa. Oh, you asked what countries they were. Australia, Austria, Canada, China, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Poland, Russia, Singapore, Slovakia, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, the UK, and the US. Those are the countries. These are the items. Now if you can go to the single item level. So this now switch gears again. You can take each of the 89 items, and what you can do is do an analysis of variance on each of the items. You can do what Bob Rosenthal at Riverside teaches us not to do. He says, don't do omnibus analysis of variance. Always do targeted analysis of variance. But we did an omnibus analysis of variance because it gives you an eta, and the eta tells you, in general, how much is this item varying across the 20 cultures. Every single one of the etas is significant, but that means nothing, or means very little. What we're interested in is which ones are varying the most. So these are the items that vary the most across cultures. So there's a more complicated way to display this, but I thought this was a good, simple way for purpose of this talk. So those are the most varying items, and then just for each one, those are the countries that were the highest and the lowest. So you see the one that varied the most across countries was, these are abbreviated items. The situation is potentially emotionally arousing, I think is what it says. Others who are present need reassurance. So apparently more people that's more common in China than in Denmark. Situations making demands on people, that's more common in Germany than in the US. People are disagreeing. The highest country out of the 20 on that is Czech Republic. Coincidentally, right after I did this analysis last spring, I was visiting Czech Republic and I gave a talk there in Brno, and I showed them this finding and they disagreed. No. Actually they agreed. They all kind of went, yeah, that makes sense. We like to disagree with each other a lot. In fact, when you get down to that there's a debate or conversation going on, that's also Czech Republic. They like to do that. It's kind of a debating culture. It's a fun place, actually. These are average ratings. So they're not frequencies, they're averages. Yeah, on a 9-point scale. Yeah, it's not that they're present absent. It's how, yeah, that's actually an important thing to bear in mind when thinking about these data. It's relative salience, right? It's how descriptive that item was relative to the other 88 in the set. So, you know, it doesn't really have an absolute interpretation. It's certainly not a frequency one. People are more likely to be in a situation that makes them feel inadequate in China, least likely in Japan.
Could that be not the situation, but the person's interpretation?
Definitely.
Which is quite similar.
Well, except that these are aggregated across the people in that culture. But yes.
Right, I mean, I'm thinking about emotionally arousing. I mean, it could be that the same two situations are going to be differentially emotionally arousing to Czech Republic people versus US people.
Yes. And that's why I've been trying to be careful in my terminology talking today, and I probably slipped a few times, to say that what I'm reporting is situational experience. What the real situation is, I'm not even sure from a cultural perspective exactly what that means. You know, I'm really not. And I actually think the average view of a situation by people in a culture might not be a bad definition of that culture. But it's certainly, the situation is filtered through their experience. There's also a Daphne Oysterman, I believe is her name, did a really neat paper some years ago now on situational construal across cultures. She didn't really have data, but she had a really neat model. And she showed all the things that led to what might make actual situations different across cultures, and then what might make perceptions of situations different across cultures. And if you look carefully at her model, which is one of these big complicated models with lots of arrows, all the same arrows point to both. So in other words, I'm not sure it makes any difference in the end, because anything that affects one of them affects the other. That's probably too strong a statement, but I mean, I understand the idea that the real situation, the experience of it is different. On the other hand, when you're doing cross-cultural comparison, I'm not quite sure what to do with that. So yes, I'm trying to repetitively say this is the experience of situations in different cultures that's being compared. The experience that the situation is uncertain is higher in China than it is in Germany. Whether it really is, I'm not even sure how to get at that. Okay. People are more likely to experience that there's a potential of being abused or victimized in Japan. What's really going on there? I don't know. Slovakia, very rare, and so forth. Okay. Here's the ones that vary the least, and I didn't put up the highest and lowest because they're very close together. These are the ones that just aren't varying very much. We've got some new data, and this used to be our least varying item, which made me very happy, but then this one supplanted it. But I like this one. You know, wherever you go around the world, members of the opposite sex are present. You know, who knew?
Wherever you go among the 20 societies that had, co-ed educational universities, members of the opposite sex.
Good point. And you know what? I've got a whole story about our attempts to get data from both Iran and from Qatar. And we can talk about that afterwards. We ran into exactly that issue. So you're right. That's more than just in these countries, yes, but very good point. Okay, so the average, this is, I don't know. This is phishing, folks. This isn't p-hacking. I would never do that. But it is phishing. It is, okay, wait. This is exploratory research. There you go. We looked at those items along the left there. So go ahead and absorb the gestalt there for a second. Those are the ones varying the most. Here's the ones varying the least. Do you see a difference between them? Just kind of as a group, kind of globally? Well, we looked at them for a long time. I'm not giving you very much time. We thought, you know what? These look more positive than these. Those look, there's exceptions. There's exceptions. But in general, inadequacy, disagreement, demands, people need reassurance, close personal relations, that's not bad. But abused and victimized, it's not clear cut. And then we looked at decisions, values, you can express your masculinity, cooperate, it's enjoyable, rational, you can be liked, you control resources, you can have immediate gratification. We thought that those situations look like more fun than the other ones, or those elements. So we went and we went back to our collaborators. We had actually 18 different international collaborators at the time. We actually had 2 more countries come in after we did this. And we had each of them rate each of the 89 items for just basically how positive or negative an aspect of experience it would be. So they just gave subjective ratings on a 9-point scale of, do you think this would be a positive or a negative element of situational experience? The reason we had our international collaborators do it was A, we're going to use their ratings internationally, so that seemed appropriate, and B, we had seen the data, and our international collaborators had not. So we had them do the ratings. And then it turns out the average positivity of the items that vary the most is lower than the positivity of the ones that vary the least. And that's like, I feel like and across all items, it's an almost significant one, correlation, but really what we're seeing here is the most varying items, the 15 most varying items are more negative than the 15 least varying items. So aspects of cultures that vary the most are more negative than aspects that vary the least. That's our tentative conclusion. It needs to be replicated, wasn't predicted, so forth. Well, it was predicted, but not by us. It was predicted by Leo Tolstoy. And we're not exactly finding that, but we are finding that, as Tolstoy might have said, happy aspects of situations are much the same around the world, but unhappy aspects of situations are different in different cultures. And one of the things all of us in psychology can do is explain a finding is once we have it. Once we have this finding, it suddenly makes sense in terms of other things as well. We actually found it just very recently in a very different data set, but I won't go into that today. But for example, if you look at health, there's really one template for being healthy, physically or mentally for that matter. But there's many ways to be unhealthy. There's one way for things to go right very often, and many ways things can go wrong that are very different from each other. So maybe there's something to that, and maybe there's something more culturally meaningful here as well going on. So these are our future directions. We actually have a grant proposal in right now. If you're a reviewer on it, give it an excellent, please. Otherwise, we'll never do it. We want to get more countries. I want to branch out into community samples. That'll present its own problems, especially in data analysis, but I want to try it. We also have data on differences in behavior across cultures, which we have not shown. We haven't really looked at very much yet, but we have that. We can also look at correlations between situations and behaviors in these different countries. We've actually only done one study with that, and actually was the first cross-cultural thing we did a couple years ago now, was we compared our US data with the Japanese data. And the reason we did it with Japan was because our Japanese collaborator was the one that gave us their data first. They were the first ones to complete their data collection. And so we looked at correlations between personality and behavior in the US and in Japan. And we found that if you didn't look at the label on the printout, you couldn't tell which was which. They were very, very similar. So if you were expecting them to be profoundly different, we didn't see it. But we could branch out and do that and more. We're also looking at personality similarity around the world using the CAQ, which has Esther Gilliam is doing her dissertation on that right now. Personality similarity around the world has been looked at a lot, but almost never with forced choice or ipsative instruments, which raises these reference group effect problems and acquiescence bias and so forth. So we're just going to see if we can replicate some of those classic findings with our data. And then theoretical hypotheses. The grant proposal I have I just put it in January 15th, is a revision of a grant proposal that got righteously slammed by the committee. Well, actually, some people in the committee liked it, but some of the evaluators liked it, but some didn't. And the ones who didn't like it said, "Where's your theory here?" And I'm like, theory? I just want to see. I just want to see what's on that island over there, right? I'm an explorer. I don't know what's there. I don't know which countries are going to be the most similar. I want to look. And no, they want to see more theory than that. And they have a point. There are theoretical things you can do. So one of the things you can do, but you need more countries, because one of the things you can do, and it's a classic method in cross-cultural psychology, is to take cultural level variables and then correlate them with various properties like situational similarity or RSQ items and so forth. We've played around a little bit with that, but right now those correlations have an N of 20, which is a number of countries. We need more. We need at least 40. And you shouldn't look at a correlation between anything and anything if your N is 20. It's just way too unstable of a number. The very next data point that comes in can throw it completely off. But once you get to about 40, they start to stabilize a little bit. So we want to get at least that many. And we have an overall driving theoretical hypothesis, which I started with, which is my overall theoretical hypothesis is that aspects of situational experience are active ingredients of culture, or maybe even the active ingredients of culture, although I don't know if they're the active ingredients, but they certainly are. At least I suspect they are active ingredients. To the extent that I can show that these aspects of situational experience are co-varying with other properties of culture that we know are important, like values, for example, or economic structure, or many others, that will tend to build our faith in our overall hypothesis that these elements of experience are important to cultural dimensions. So we've long needed a tool for assessing situations, and now we have one. You can use it for lots of purposes. And some versions of my talk I title it, What You Can Do with the RSQ. There's lots of things you can do. We did it cross-situational consistency. We did theoretical templates. We did cross-cultural comparison. You could compare workplaces. You could compare different subcultural environments, rich areas, poor areas, and so forth. There's just a million different possibilities. Also, situational construal. We actually have a whole different project that I didn't get into before, but I did show you the model. That situational construal, your individual construal of the situation, is a joint function of the situation as it is and your own personality. We find, by the way, and you evolutionary people won't be surprised to find, that the lion's share of the variance in your situational construal comes from, guess what? Reality. because that's probably adaptive, right? There's nothing to stop me from construing that I can fly off the roof of this building, but it would be a fatal construal, and my genes would not be propagated any further after I did that. So, you need to be related to reality, but there's still room for situational construal as well. There are some interesting gender differences that we found, and some personality differences as well. We also saw today some exploration of some implications from evolutionary theory, at least Kenrick and Schaller's version of it, and we looked at cross-cultural differences. So Thurston's law says something exists, it exists to some degree, and you can measure it. And situations exist, I will say, and it's time to start measuring them. So those are my international collaborators, who were all real contributors to this. They didn't just do translations, but they helped me interpret and understand a lot of this. We're in frequent contact with many of them. And then here's our local contributors. And thank you. So I was told you guys like to talk. Yes.
So I'm going to pick at the evolutionary part of this a little bit, but so it seems like instead of taking your items and using the system where you kind of have to force each one into one of those 7 categories, and I'm going to quibble about the categories in a minute, but that it seems like it might make more sense to have them scored somehow to differentiate those items that fit quite cleanly into one of those categories versus the ones that don't, and then you can actually make some predictions about the consistency with which you might expect to see them across cultures. So things that are going to be more salient to survival or things like that might be things that you would expect to see maybe either more consistently or more consistently at least correlated with the particular risks in that society related to that variable.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
so you're worried that things weren't really characteristic of some sort of...
well, I just think that some of them probably fit quite clearly, as you saw with that list, right? Like the affiliation one, like probably we could all say, yeah, that seems to pretty clearly fit into some sort of an affiliation or mate seeking or some sort of social box. And others of them, it seems like random guessing which one of those it would be related to. And so I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, no, there's a... I could easily take the next 20 minutes talking about that. I'll try not to. There's a lot of different ways to get templates and to do these kinds of data. I started doing this back in graduate school when Daryl Ben was my advisor, and in his pre-ESP days. And we did what was called template matching, and we had people, we did theoretically derived personality templates in those days, and just by having people check off the items that were relevant, rather than do a distribution. You can also, but what I have found empirically, and there's statistical reasons I think it would be true too, but empirically, it ends up not making as much difference as one might think. And the reason is that the Q sort is so restrictive at its top and bottom end. Out of the 89 items, only 3 of them can get a 9, only 3 of them can get a 1, and only a few more that can get an 8 or a 2. And so statistically, it's the items that end up in those categories that end up driving the bus. And the ones in between just don't have as much influence because they're in the middle of the distribution. So you could do it that way, or you could just do it with just the 9s and the 1s.
Except some of your ones were, I thought, some of the most ambiguous statements in the bunch, as far as which evolutionary box you were going to put them in.
Yeah, what I don't have with me is the actual templates of what went into those categories. It'd be interesting to have you look at those and see if they make sense to you.
No, just one more really quick
Sure.
thing.
But people don't like the Q sort. I mean, a lot of people just really hate doing them. Because they
I'm
don't
not
like...
opposed to the idea of the method at all.
Yeah,
okay.
okay.
I'm not. I just, in thinking about how to apply it to evolutionary theory, I think it may not be the clearest fit, but
Or here's another thing you could do, and I would love it if somebody at UCLA would do this. Write your own deck. Write your own items. Because these items were not, they're written to be general purpose, and as you've seen, we've used them in a lot of different ways. I really like that. I like having something that we could use in all of these different things, and it seems to work kind of okay in a lot of different contexts. But I suspect if you wrote it, but that's the bandwidth fidelity trade-off, right? That if we wrote a set of items, for example, particularly designed for cross-cultural comparison, it probably wouldn't be the same items we've got. If we wrote a particular set of items just to test evolutionary theory, it wouldn't be the items we've got. So we're trying to, I like the idea of using the same instrument for a lot of different purposes. On the other hand, I think complementary to that, I don't think a replacement, but a complement to that would be specific items written for specific applications. And I think that could be really interesting. And I even think the exercise of writing those items could be really interesting.
I would start with revising Kenrick's 7, because they look to me like, what do evolutionary psychologists study? Here are these 7 things. And it doesn't seem to be to me necessarily relevant of, like, for example, like Dan mentioned, I don't know whether you mentioned eat food, and I was thinking labor or work. I mean, there are like major things that are, yeah, it's.
Oh, I see, you were talking about the actual categories themselves.
No, I was perhaps unfairly, when the camera's running. Hi Doug, hi Steve. You know, those are, exactly, this is what American social psychologists who do evolutionary psychology with American undergraduate students think the major adaptive problems are. That's not necessarily what is out there in the world. I mean, I think there's another problem, which is that you quite rightly, repeatedly said you're studying experience, which is great. Situations are not experience, so whether the lion rushing at you is a threat or a challenge makes a big difference in your experience. If you bring it from the perspective of that list of 7 or whatever other list you want to have, the fact that there's a lion rushing at you is what matters. And so the marriage of those two things is always going to be problematic.
I understand why you picked 7 in the evening to kind of get started, but I watch monkeys, and behavior and situations vary enormously according to time of day, according to season of the year. Particularly if you want to get into understanding economies and how people get the resources that they need, you have to expand this like enormously to cover parts of the day when people are working and when people are not just such an obviously coming home at dinner time, but what they do on Saturday afternoon.
No, I agree, and that's why if you get my grant to renew, or to review, you should give it a really good rating, because that's one of the things we're gonna do, is look at different times of day and different periods during the week as well. I hadn't thought of seasons of the year, but that's also interesting.
Well, and latitude and relationships to seasons
Yeah,
of
right.
the year,
I mean,
because of how short the day is.
Right,
and
you
how
do it in Norway when it's
yeah.
dark all day, it's,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't, yeah.
There's just, well, there's so many things that you can't do them all at once in
Right,
one time.
right, and this was an entering wedge really just to see if it was even feasible. And it's kind of it's kind of an overgrown pilot study, because first we had, coincidentally, just as we were getting started with this, I was visiting Japan, and the Japanese collaborator, Tetsuya Sato, was very interested in this stuff, and so that's why he got his data before anybody else did, and we did a bunch of this early stuff together. And then we just thought, well, I wonder what other countries we could get, and we found that recruiting international collaborators wasn't terribly hard. What can I tell you about our, I want to answer your questions, but I could tell you what happened with our attempt to get Arabic.
But I found myself wondering how, if the countries would be more different if we looked at their workday, even within modern cultures, how they perceive their situation during their
Yeah,
workday.
yeah, and actually one of the
There's a
things,
whole set of
I want to collaborate with IO psychologists, because I want to do people doing RSQs during the workday in different employment settings. Like, and maybe even things like successful and unsuccessful companies. Like right now, Apple is innovating very, very well, right? Yahoo, not so much, right? Is there a difference in the situational experience of the people in those two workplaces? I have no idea, but if somebody wants to pay me a lot of money, I'll go find
Yeah,
out.
you could get rich.
Or somebody else could, you can have the idea for free. Should I tell you what happened with our Arabic? You wanna-
Well, if there are more questions, maybe now's an opportune time to
Yeah,
take.
but let me make sure we,
So,
yeah.
this is probably going to come out quite vague what I have going on. So, it feels to me that there's a sense in which the way you're analysing your data, the individuals are treated quite passively. So it's what situation is the individual in, as if these individuals have dropped into these situations, and then they have. But individuals create situations and choose which situations to put themselves in. And I had that thought in my mind through the talk, and it puts, for me, it kind of shed some new light on some of your results. So just for one example, at the beginning you had between individual differences and within individual differences in describing the situation. But it occurred to me that these could well be two different ways of describing the same situation.
Or two different ways of describing the person in a way, right?
Well, no, so some person said I was making dinner, and another person said I was arguing with my boyfriend.
Oh, I see.
Right? They could actually be doing exactly the same things as each other.
Mm.
Right? But they're just describing it differently.
Mhm.
And you only see that when you start to take into account the individual is out there with cognitive and biological goals, acting on the world. And yet you're treating the data as if they're kind of a bit more passive than that.
Well, okay, a couple of things. One is, we can analyze our data. We actually, for some, not all of our countries, for our US data, we have personality data on these people.
Right.
So we can look at their situational experience as a function of their personality, which is one way to get, I think, the issue you're talking about. And here's a counterintuitive finding. We actually found very little there. And I was very surprised by that. I actually thought there would be big differences in how situations experienced by people who are high and low in extroversion, for example, and there was less than I would have predicted, and I'm still not sure what to do with that, which is why it's not part of the talk. Another thing you can do, and we have done, is to get at some of the issues you're talking about, in the whole idea of construal in general. You need to move out of the real world and back into the lab. And so we've done that. So we have a really big data set. We actually just finished 3 years of data collection. Our research style in our lab has always been amass a big data set for several years and then spend at least twice that long analyzing it. So we just, last fall, completed a 3-year data collection where we had about 220 UCR undergraduates. This is different from the data you just saw. We come into the lab and engage in 4 different 3-person interactions with different partners each time, which we video recorded. And then afterwards, we have behavioral ratings using RBQ of the videos from our research assistants. We also have situational ratings from a different set of RAs of the situation, so how that looks to a dispassionate observer. We also have the situational perceptions of each of the 3 people in that room. So we can do a couple of different things. We can look at construal as defined by how do you see the situation differently from the other 2 people who were also there with you, which is one way to get at what you're saying. Probably most directly getting what you're saying. The other is construal compared to everybody else who's in that similar situation. So our situations, I misspoke, we don't have 4, we have 3. So the first one is an unstructured interaction for 3 people, runs for several minutes. A couple weeks later, they play a game called Simon, if you've ever played it. And we do it because it's a game. You can tell who's winning or losing because it's a sound game. And in the third situation, they have to build a Tinker Toy together. And if they all finish it according to this model that we've shown them, they all get an extra $5. So they're motivated. So we have all those things recorded. We can look at construal on 2 levels. We can look at construal in terms of your similarity to the average of the other 2 people in the room, which was why we went to the great expense of getting 3-person groups rather than 2-person groups. Many of you who run actual human subjects know that it's about 4 times as difficult to assemble a 3-person group as it is a dyad. But we got it. But we needed that because we needed to know who the odd person out was. So each person is compared to the average of their 2 partners. Also, you can take everybody in all of the unstructured interactions and just compare your perception to just that. So one is the situation at the level of the experimental condition, if you want to think of it that way. Another is the situation at the level of the particular triad you were in. Agree with me? So we're actually in the process of analyzing those data right now. It was partially analyzed by Alicia Todd's doctoral dissertation, which was finished last summer. There's still a lot more to do, but the short version is that it sort of doesn't matter which way you do it. Those 2 ways of analyzing construal, one of them, by the way, requires a lot more programming in R than the other one. The triad level one is a nightmare to program, but we finally got it going. It turns out, though, to give you essentially the same results, which is that construing things differently from the average of how most people see it means you're odd. Again, not really surprising, right? But it tends to be correlated with socially inept behaviors, looking uncomfortable, feeling uncomfortable, and in general, what you would see is behavioral manifestations of not being a socially successful person. Yeah. You were simultaneous.
Right.
I was gonna say, I mean, it actually, along the lines of what Tom was suggesting, thinking of, is there a way for you to do something like have some objective, maybe from the videos or something, or description of the situations, and then have people see how good people would be at inferring which of the situations it is from people's choices on your card sort. Right. So I mean, and this would get at what Brooke is saying. What Brooke was saying.
You mean, so I show you an RSQ and I say, can you tell whether this is an instruction situation,
this
the
guy's
game,
eating
or
dinner
the...
with his family, this guy's
Oh, I see.
doing whatever, and you make them decide which of those situations the person is describing.
We didn't do that. I'm not quite sure how we do that. We did something related to that, though. And this was I didn't put this up, but this was a study of cult situation in Stroll that was published in JRP, I guess, last year. What we did was we took those 3x5 cards,
Yeah.
and we had research assistants do RSQs based only on that. Okay, so usually they just say things like buying socks at Target with my mom, but they say they're very straightforward little phrases. And our German club, one of our German collaborators, John Routman, calls them W questions, because they're supposed to ask who, what, and where they were, and that's when people pretty much get, some people ignore what you told them to do, but most people pretty straightforwardly do that. So we had our RAs do an RSQ of what that sort of nominally was.
Yeah.
And then we compared the subject's actual RSQ with that.
Yeah.
And found some differences there. There were a whole bunch. One that just, extroverts were more likely to see social interaction being important than you would think just from the content of the card. Men were more likely to see that somebody might be being blamed for something than men were. Than women were. Than you would think compared to what people would get off the card. There were a few other differences like that. So that's one way to sort of get it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about this literature in brain mapping, where they've looked at, if you give somebody a task in the scanner, there's a lot of consistency in what areas are activated. But then if you try to guess what the task was that the subject was doing from the patterns of activation, it's actually hard to do, right? So if you go in different inferences in different directions.
Well, it's sort of like, in the domain of personality, which is a lot more developed than this, right? And I really do think situational assessment is where personality assessment was in 1935. But if you go to personality, which is a lot more, a field that's a lot more developed, I can get two people doing a Q sort of view and a view and a view who know each of you well, and they will agree well. That's an empirical fact. We actually know they will agree pretty well in general in their descriptions of you. If we turn around and we give them the Q sort and say, which of these three guys is it? That would be really hard.
It'd be hard.
And I don't know whether people could or not. I don't know anybody who's tried that, but I suspect it would be very difficult. You haven't asked anything yet.
Okay, just a quick kind of methodological question. So when they're doing this task, they see all the possible categories at the same time, right? And then they're dragging and dropping?
Well, it's a two-stage process, and it's inherited from the old way we used to do it with paper cards, which is first they sort into 3 piles,
Right.
and then they have the distribution of 9.
Okay, so I'm curious with, so I guess 2 things, although I think they're both really quick. Once you have them into the 3 categories, when you're just putting them into the distribution it's numerically restricted, do you have either any data or any intuitions about whether people kind of weigh their choices and put things in, or whether they kind of add things in and then swap them in and out of categories as they're working in the distributions? I'm just curious about the reasoning processes. And then 2 is,
does the ways in which people distribute either from the top down or from the bottom up or from the middle out or from the outsides in relate to personality? Are they more likely to say like, you know, this situation is not any of these things, might relate to some personality traits as opposed to,
You know, those are great questions that our program doesn't capture.
okay.
But there's nothing to stop that. I mean, the program is, the first program that allowed Q-sorts to be done on a computer screen instead of with paper cards was written by a woman, by a guy we hired. And that program is on our lab website, and you can download it. It runs on PCs. It's very flexible. You can write your own item content. So I'm serious about, if you have your own items you're interested in, you can write your own item content. You can have any number of items you want. You can create your own distribution. It's flexible with all of that. Just read the instructions before you start using it. It's becoming unstable because it's a PC. It's based on Microsoft Net. And Windows 9 or Windows 8 doesn't really work. But nothing works in Windows 8, right? But Windows 7 it works. In Windows 10 it'll probably work. But anyway, there's that program. And then there's the web-based one, which is a completely different program, which is where you do it. The first program you have to download physically onto your computer and then sit there and do it. This other one is web-based. It's also becoming unstable, which is one of the things we need to rewrite the programming. And we do not at present capture whether they start at the end and work their way to the middle, how often they swap items. We don't have any way of knowing any of that. We do know how long it took them to do the sort from beginning to end, but that's the only thing we capture. There's nothing in principle stopping us from doing that, and that would be really cool. My intuition is, having done a lot of Q-sorts myself, is that people generally start lumping things mostly into the descriptive end, because that's the way our brains work. And then we discover there's too many there, and then we have to work to spread them out. And we end up getting really frustrated that you couldn't put 3 there. But that's where you start getting information. As my old mentor Jack Block used to say, do you want to be healthy? Do you want to be wealthy? Do you want to be wise? And then he says, now rank order them. Because that's where you get information. And in this case, people have a bunch of things they want to agree with, but they still have to rank order.
I am sorry to have to end this wonderful conversation, but unfortunately, you're.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.